Hello, today we will be exploring the Second World War in the universe of my previous video, What if the Circular Powers won World War I? Sit back and enjoy the video. Japan. Like Britain, it is an island defined by conflict and warfare. Before the Second World War broke out, the king of Shikoku, one of the Japanese states, was offered the throne of Tohoku. After he accepted this, the other Japanese states rallied together to put an end to this new nation, yet their efforts were useless, and Shikoku, with support from the Gear Axis, would unite the southern Japanese Isles. A bit more east, the Star Powers and the Gear Axis would come together and realize that, despite their differences, they would need to work together if they were ever going to conquer the world. So they decided to sign the Eushan Pact, after the two Chinese and Indian generals would meet and divide Bangladesh between them. Vietnam, despite them also being granted land, was still mad about allying China. This was because Vietnam still claimed China's land as theirs. In Europe, the former triangular powers would start remilitarizing, going against the Treaty of Rome. The Dutch would claim that since they were not the government who signed the treaty, they were not obliged to follow it, and as for the others, their military was being assisted by the Dutch. Yet when the Dutch army would put their military on the border of Loire, the Dutch, French, Roman, and Ukrainian governments would meet in the French capital to discuss the future of the area. It was ultimately decided that France and the Netherlands would back off from Brittany, whilst Loire would cede minor lands to the Netherlands. Loire, Brittany, nor Hibernia were invited to this conference. The Ukrainian Prime Minister would return to Sevastopol proclaiming, "Peace for our time." Yet only a few hours later, reports would come in from Loire saying Dutch and French troops were marching through their capital. After this, the Arrow Accord would proclaim that should any Gear troops set foot in Brittany, it would be war. 1 year later, the French armies invaded, and the Arrow Accord would declare war on the Gear Axis. World War II had begun. A Roman ship, attempting to help Bretonians escape, would be sunk by the French blockade. Rome demanded the French stop the blockade, but to no avail. Due to this, Rome declared war on the Gear Axis as well, and the Circle Powers joined in solidarity. Fearing the inevitable Mesopotamian entry, Arabia would invade Mesopotamia and bring the Pentagon Pact into the war as well. At this point, China believed this was the Great War that would bring their global hegemony and joined the war as well. World War II had now truly gone global. Immediately after the circular entry, the Dutch and Austrians would strike deep into Poland and France into Rome. And the Copenhagen area was re-annexed into the Dutch Empire. The French would also lead an invasion of Britain, forcing the Hibernians to retread to Ireland and the Hebrides. Men would see some of the bloodiest battles seen in history, with the Dutch navy attempting multiple invasions of the island and the Hibernians continuously pushing them back, whilst reinforcements to the island were blown up by the new French superweapon, the submarine. Any aerial landings were shot down by Dutch fighter planes, and bombers would tear the island apart. The 1st to 5th Battle of Meun would all be in the top 20 deadliest battles in human history, in particular the Second Battle of Meun, who ranks first. Meanwhile, Rome, Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland were being pushed hard by the Gear powers. Rome fell and was forced to retreat to Africa and Malta. While Greece's mainland fell, they were forced to retreat to their islands, and Crete would put up a fierce defense in the Bosporus. And Ukraine retreated to the Dnieper/Dwina line. In Asia, both Hokkaidos would unite into a federation, pledging to global neutrality. Similar to Switzerland all those millennia ago. And China with Japan would launch their invasion of Amur and Ukraine. Both would push far north, capturing the Amurite capital with ease. Yet they were not fast enough. As winter set in, the front would stalemate. In the Indian Ocean, China was quickly pushed out of Australia and New Guinea. Whilst India would launch an island-hopping campaign across the Maldives, Seychelles, and other islands. It is here that Tanzania would truly prove itself as a powerful state by having their navy facing the Indian one, and despite everyone's expectations, winning most of the time. Arabia, as previously mentioned, launched an invasion of Mesopotamia. Most land below the Euphrates and east of the Suez would fall, including the Mesopotamian capital. It was here that Arabia's horrific plans would be carried out, and many people who lived in the area that were not considered pure old Empyreans would be gathered and exterminated in horrible ways. The Romans still held naval dominance in the Mediterranean. This was shown when the Romans recaptured Sicily, ending the siege of Sardinia. Later they would also start reconquering the Balearic Islands. The Gear Axis would find a way to deal with Rome, invade through the African Union. the Union's resistance was brave but ultimately futile. As the advancing Spanish and Catalan troops approached the Roman border, they found a wall of bunkers and trenches from the coast into the Sahara. This would prove effective at stopping the advance of Gir tanks, resulting in trench warfare being implemented in the African theater. The Gir Axis would try the same in West Africa but to the same results. In the Balkans, Montana would house many resistance organizations against the occupying powers. In response, they would be invaded, dragging the Octagon Axis into the war too. Portugal would be overrun, forcing their escape to Somalia. In the Americas, the war was quickly over. Mexico stood no chance against literally the rest of the continents attacking them. Going back to Europe, a major offensive was ordered against Ukraine, the Dnieper was crossed and troops approached Tallinn, and Smolensk, the old Russian capital, was put under siege. The Battle of Smolensk would be one of the bloodiest of the entire war, yet in the end Ukraine won the battle. In the south, Crimea was cut off by the Gir Axis, yet a counteroffensive would cut those troops off themselves, trapping a major part of the Gir army of Europe. An Ukrainian counteroffensive would push the Gir powers back across the Dnieper. This was the beginning of the end for the European Gir powers. In Asia, the fight was far from over. From North America, Amur's and Chile's navy would harass the Sino-Japanese one. Battle after battle, the Chinese would be pushed back. In the Indian Ocean, Tanzania would lead a naval invasion of India, landing near Vakad and Panani. The invasion was a major success, and Aero troops would move into India. This would be enough for Ukraine to convince Pakistan to join the war to reclaim their land. Hibernia would send troops to assist Tanzania, beginning the race for India. In under 5 months, India would fall and be split. In the Middle East, Arabia would be pushed back and would fall soon after India. With one less front to worry about, and with China being distracted in the Pacific, Ukraine and Amur would launch a massive counteroffensive, reclaiming a majority of their land. Amur would successfully invade Japan, causing their capitulation. After this, China would surrender, declaring that the war situation had developed not necessarily to China's favor. South and North American troops would assist Hibernia in their reconquest of Britain, landing in Cornwall and moving to cut off the troops from mainland Europe. This would be a massive success, and the Reichskommissariat Britanniae would surrender to Hibernia. As the Dutch had expected an invasion to only happen in Britain, they did not fortify the European mainland, making an invasion of the flatlands quite easy to do. Now, the full circular army was focused on Europe. Tanks, planes, and ground troops would move to liberate the Balkans and Italy, whilst the Arrow Accord would capture Jutland and Amsterdam. In Africa, forces were withdrawn. Hibernia, fearing that Rome would now conquer all of the African Union, invaded Morocco and consolidated the northern coast, causing the troops of the Gir Axis to be cut off and surrender. Portuguese partisans would liberate their homeland, and with France falling to the Arrow Accord and Catalonia to Rome. Spain would be the last Gir Axis nation to surrender, after Vietnam fell to a joint Pakistani-Arrow invasion. After the war ended, the new borders needed to be drawn. India and Vietnam would be split between the Arrow Accord, the Pentagon powers and the Circular powers, creating new puppet governments in the liberated lands. Arabia would be annexed entirely by Mesopotamia, technically forming the old empire. Chinese Australia would be split between Tanzania, Ukraine and the now independent Republic of Tasmania. China would also need to give concessions to Amur and Ukraine. Japan was annexed by Amur. Meanwhile, the two states in Central Asia who were part of the Pentagon powers before the war were given new governments aligned to Ukraine, destroying relations between Mesopotamia and Ukraine. In Africa, the African Union was split into two, the southern half aligned to Rome and the northern half aligned to Hibernia. Spain had to give territories to Portugal and the Northern African Union, whilst Catalonia became a Roman puppet. France had to withdraw from all lands it had occupied and gained a new pro-Arrow government, Loire and Brittany the same, whilst Brittany's exclave became an independent nation after Brittany refused to re-annex it. The Netherlands lost two southern provinces who became Roman puppets, whilst Germany would split away and together with Austria become an Polish/Ukrainian puppet. The monarchy would return to the remnants of the Netherlands, and would join the Arrow Accord. Jutland split off as an Scandinavian-aligned nation but kept the monarchy, with the brother of the Dutch queen becoming the Jutlandic king. In North America, two southern states would be split off from Mexico around linguistic lines. Honduras was Spanish whilst Guatemala was Dutch, and both would join the Arrow Accord. The rest of Mexico would join the Circular powers. The former St. Lawrence Republic would be split, the east would be returned to Portugal whilst the west would be aligned to Hibernia. A small southern strip would become an Canadian puppet as Canada demanded to be compensated for assisting in the war there. Following the war, the great powers, fueled by debt and instability, would begin decolonizing. The Hibernian Congo, as well as the other nations in southern Africa except for Juba, would join Tanzania to form the African Federation. Nigeria and Mauritania would be given independence but would remain aligned to Sevastopol, despite the populations leaning towards the Arrow Accord. Eritrea and Somalia would remain with their overlords whilst Libya and Egypt were integrated into Rome as the local people adopted their culture and language. In Guinea, something interesting would happen. Amur would not smash all the cultures together like Ukraine and Poland had done, but instead let every subdivision of their colony decide for themselves. Many would join into two different confederations, one aligned to the Circular Powers and one aligned to the Arrow Accord. Whilst two decided for complete independence and neutrality or aligning to Mesopotamia. In the Americas, Hibernia would slowly grant their South American colonies independence yet ensuring they stayed aligned to them. Meanwhile, their North American colonies asked to join Hibernia directly, which Hibernia accepted, embracing them as provinces instead of colonies. Ukraine and Rome would give their two colonies independence as well whilst Amur integrated their territories quite well. Amur would change their ways after the war concluded. Before the war they were ruled by an oligarchy only interested in power and expansion, yet after the war, the military with support from the people overthrew the government and established a democracy. Ukraine, dealing with decolonization and a broken economy that just got out of war, decided not to intervene. Amur would thus forward be unaligned and become a battleground of politics for Ukraine, Hibernia, and Mesopotamia, who were now in a three-way Cold War with each other. As world tensions increase again and the three nations try to influence the international community to their favor, Hibernia and the Netherlands would shock the world by successfully detonating their first nuclear bomb in Greenland. Within a year both Ukraine and Mesopotamia would replicate the weapon, causing tensions to increase more as bomb production massively increases. With tensions this high, only one thing is for certain. World War II was not the war to end all wars, it was the war to intensify all wars. Thank you all for watching all the way to this point in the video. This literally took me an entire week to make and the quality is still questionable. I plan to improve these videos in the future. Yet for now this is the end of the video and I hope you all enjoyed.